Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I get a good morning? Good morning, okay, yeah, I know there were at least a few folks who didn't make it to U2 last night, and many of you probably did, and I said, oh, good morning. My name's Steve Drucker. I'm the founder and president of Fig Leaf Software and your special celebrity guest instructor for today's presentation on Lightning Component Best Practices, or as I like to call it, how to get stuff done and make stuff work. So we're going to look at some pretty prescient issues related to Lightning development, including reducing your debugging time. It's probably where we spend quite a bit of time. We want to get stuff done. Less tools to help us debug are going to be very helpful. And just a show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves to be web developers or come from a traditional web development background? Okay, so about maybe about a third of you to a half. Okay, good. So that's really what my background is. It's primary web application development for about the last 20 years or so, going back to very first iteration of Microsoft, Internet Explorer 3 and Netscape 2. Anybody remember Netscape 2? Those were like the good old days, right? Awesome. Yeah, they were great. Actually, not so much. So we'll talk about upgrading your app to Winter 17. One of my jobs for Salesforce is to actually develop and maintain the official Salesforce University curriculum, Dev 601, building Lightning components. And so we just finished that upgrade, and there are some pretty significant changes in there, so we can kind of compare and contrast how you can greatly simplify your code in moving to Winter 17. We'll talk about consistently handling data requests, using inheritance to improve robustness. That's a really big deal because how many of you have worked with developing Lightning components for the last 2 or 3 releases? Anybody? So a few of you. So you know that things are changing fairly rapidly, right? So you want your code to be as agile and as flexible as possible to be able to accommodate those changes. We'll look at setting properties versus invoking public methods versus raising events. If you work with a lot of the different sort of out-of-the-box components with Lightning, you may have some confusion in terms of what the best practice is for rolling your own components. There are some components you affect out of the box by firing an event. Others you call a method. Still others you deal with attributes. So we'll maybe talk about that a little bit and when you should use each technique. We can improve our productivity by using some Locker-compatible libraries, and then we'll get into the danger zone of things that you can do that will significantly improve the overall usefulness of your application, but you may wind up having compatibility issues in the future. But you got to kind of get stuff done, right? So a little bit about me. Again, I come from a traditional web app development background. I've got 4 or 5 books available for sale off of Amazon, all related to web development, built Dev 601, and I also do production level web development as well at my company, Fig Leaf Software, where I was the technical architect and lead coder for the subway system, which is a beta.wamada.com in Washington, DC. So that's a really cool site. Go check that out. First thing is reducing your debugging time. And one of the issues if you're working in a development team with Lightning is how do you share code effectively? A lot of us are kind of putting together unmanaged packages, and when you have unmanaged packages, chances are you might have 2 or more developers from different organizations possibly that are all naming their components the same thing, because when you have an unmanaged package, you don't necessarily have to specify a namespace, unique namespace, like you would have to do with managed packages. So that's the first thing, is kind of coming up with a really good naming convention for your company or for your work group to make sure that you don't have conflicts on both the components and also the component resources as well. Chrome Debugger, every time there's a new release of Chrome, they improve the debugging, and there's a couple really cool hidden features in Chrome that I want to demonstrate for you today and make you aware of. In particular, one of the best practices for doing any kind of HTML5 web development is to kind of keep the DOM, the document object model, as light as possible. So that puts you into a model where you're dynamically creating and destroying components on the fly. And so being able to confirm that those components are in fact actually being destroyed can be really helpful to you. We're also going to go and take a look at eliminating some of the more annoying aspects of web development, like clearing cache, clearing HTML5 local storage, clearing all the stuff that might be legacy in your application to make sure that you're running from a clean sheet of paper. Lightning Linter plugin is awesome. It takes all of your controller code and basically all of your JavaScript, fires it off to Heroku and validates that code, so it can help you avoid that drudgery of saving and testing and going back, finding you have a syntax error, that rinse repeat cycle, and Lightning Inspector, of course. So, the key to doing any development, what I've found, is using the debugger keyword. So if you want to insert a programmatic breakpoint into your code, you just put in debugger semicolon. It can go in any controller function. It can go in any helper. And as soon as the browser hits that line of code, execution is going to stop, and you'll be able to step through the code and inspect all the variables very easily. And this has really been invaluable to me for both learning Lightning as well as figuring out some of the perhaps undocumented features, so to speak, of the platform, some of which we'll be talking about today. So let me do a quick little demo here of debugging. And one of the things that I've tried to do in this presentation is giving you a lot of code. Okay, so we've got 5 or 6 different components here that are on a GitHub repo that you can go and download. And the first thing we're going to look at is this alert box component. And the alert box component, basically, what that does is you can instantiate an alert box in your application, and then anytime you want to open the alert box, you can just go and, in a controller, just go ahead and get a hold of that and then call an alert method, and that will actually go and pop it up. So let's go ahead and we're going to go and try and run that. Now, if I run into any severe programmatic issues, I did bring the ultimate fail-safe for debugging. I've got my Doctor Who sonic screwdriver. So, you just take that and that goes and fixes it, right? So, awesome. Doctor Who is great. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at this. Let's actually come over here to my test alert. So here's my test alert. I'm going to go and run this. And in order for breakpoints and whatnot to really be working, you have to go and have your developer tools console open, which I'm going to do here. And I'll go ahead and click, and so that fires off our method, and we get a nice little SLDS-based alert box that pops up. And this is something where when you close the alert box, it's actually going to destroy operations. It's going to remove the component and all of the markup that is associated with it. So one of the cool things that you can do to confirm this in the debugger is you can right-click on it, and you'll get it'll show you the generated markup. And then you can right-click actually on anything here in the DOM, and there's this really cool feature here called break on. And so I can say that I want to go and have a debugger break on node removal, right? So now that I've actually got that into place, when I hit OK, we're going to programmatically destroy the component. And you can see now it's paused in the debugger, and we've hit that breakpoint, and I can kind of inspect, what's going on behind the scenes with Lightning and Aura to see what's really going on there. So I thought that was kind of cool. Also, you run into issues a lot of times when you're building Lightning components with adding and removing CSS styles. So the folks, so you may have noticed actually, if I go in, I rerun this again. Okay. And I do an inspect. One of the other features that you have in here is to break on attribute modification. So you could have, different essentially card layers that we're going to look at in just a few minutes, and you could have a breakpoint anytime those style classes get changed, which can really be useful in helping you debug as opposed to helping you resolve issues where things may actually fail silently. Okay. So that's a pretty cool feature. Another key feature that we talked about is the Lightning linter. So this is actually a plugin for Chrome you can download. Right? So Lightning linter Chrome. And the way that works is when you've got a developer console that's up, like I've got here, when I go over to my controller or my helper, you'll see that the code's actually being linted, and in the problems tab, it's showing me that I've got potential issues here. These are actually more on the warning side, but it's saying that the helper argument isn't used, so I can just kind of knock that out, and you can see that it goes and changes that, and every second it's passing that data back up. So that's kind of a huge help to reduce some of those development cycles that you might be running into. Clear Cache plugin. So the Clear Cache plugin is something that's pretty straightforward. I know as a web developer, you kind of always get burned by caching issues. It just basically puts a little recycle button up here on your browser toolbar, and when you click on it, you can set it up so it'll clear the cache. It will go and clear local storage. It'll clear out basically everything. And again, another free great plugin. I kind of live and die by this thing. Clearing app cache, local storage, cookies, basically anything you need to make sure that you're looking at the absolute latest run of your code. Okay, all right. So all free stuff, all cool. Sounds good? Good. All right. And then in terms of actually using the debugger, if we come back and we take a look here at our little alert box, I'll go ahead and I'll open up the controller here. Okay, I can simply just input the word debugger, save that out, and now when I run the app, again, as long as I've got the debugger open, I can go and hit, click me. It's fired off it's established the breakpoint, and then I can go in and watch and inspect all kinds of different variables, and you can actually just hover over variables to see what their values are and inspect them as well. And that's really helpful when you get into eventing, because you can inspect the event object and see what properties are actually being passed. Okay. All right. Okay. Good. All right. First step to productivity is making sure you get through the bugs quickly. All right. So next up, I can find my slide deck, which appears to have disappeared. Here it is. All right. All right, and there are certainly days where I kind of feel like this from Starship Troopers, where you've gone and crushed the bugs. It's a good day. All right, so next thing is upgrading your app to Winter 17. And one of the challenges in building a presentation like this is that the best practices, it seems like, are constantly changing. And I know that a number of you probably haven't had a chance to really work with Winter 17. It does actually simplify your code a lot, but a lot of things have actually changed. One of the big things is that the Salesforce Lightning Design System is now automatically included for you, so you no longer have to upload it as a static resource. You don't have to put in a Lightning require tag to load it up, and you no longer have to include or wrap everything in a div class equals slids block, which is great. Less code is always better code. You also have these great new Lightning components for tab panel and button. How many of you were using the SLDSX components? Anybody out there, right? So those were, a little clunky. We kind of used them because they were there, and they made our lives a little bit easier. But these are much more robust and directly supported by Salesforce. Also, if you had to deal with SVG and using the SVG icon helper, using that has largely gone away. So we're going to do a little bit of a side-by-side demo here. And this is actually some code that you build in the Dev 601 course, but actually I'm making it available to you here. And let's just kind of see what this thing actually does. So this is the app that you actually build out over the course of a week in Dev 601, and there's a tab set in there. And we'll talk about using Lightning tab set and then customizing it so you can move the tabs to the bottom and adding icon tabs. But the piece that we're looking at here is our panic button. And so the idea behind this relatively simple control is that you can select from a list of sounds. These sounds are uploaded to static resources. The data to populate this Lightning select box is actually coming from an Apex call. And so, told some sales folks around the office, anytime they get bad news from a customer, just hit the button. And you get the official theme song of developers everywhere, right? Sad trombone, developers and system administrators. And then, for projects that are, having some issues, of course, you can just. So I hear that several times a day, and it's usually actually coming out of my own machine. So let's kind of take a look at the code for that. And we'll kind of compare and contrast panic button from summer 16 against winter 17. So the first thing here is we've got our component, and on the component you can set some default attributes. for the sound, the message that you want to display, and there's a private property here for sound URL. We had to go and load SLDS as a static resource in Summer 16, and we also had to include this div tag to get any of those styles to actually interoperate or be effective on the component. And we also may have created some helper classes to center content, and we used the UI button control along with a huge amount of CSS to go and style our multifaceted button. And we had a UI input select to go and display that drop-down list, and we have a audio tag here to go and play our video or our audio clips along with our message, right? So when we look at the CSS that's associated with this, it's fairly significant. We've got this .panic button, which is going to this button sprite. In terms of best practices, one of the things that you're always trying to do as a mobile web developer is to reduce the number of HTTP calls that your application needs to make. And a lot of HTTP calls are generated by just having images on the page. So what you do in a sprite situation is you actually take a bunch of different images and you save them out as a single image, and then you actually use CSS to then go and sort of cut the image up on the client. So you can see here I've got one image, but on hover, I use background position to select essentially a different image in that image set, and then on focus there's another one, or active there's a different one on top of that, right? So you always want to be really, really careful, or as careful as you can possibly be, to reduce HTTP transactions. So it really improves your performance by quite a bit. Okay. So we've got our client-side controller here. So on the controller, again, another best practice, and if you've been to any of the Lightning sessions here at the show, you've probably seen a number of different variations on this, but it's having some sort of abstraction layer for making Apex calls to force.com. And in this case, I've got a little helper function that I created where I just tell it what Apex controller method I want to call. I then drop in an asynchronous callback function, which is going to go and receive the data that's generated from that call. And then the way that the UI input select component worked is that largely you were kind of looping through that data and then kind of programmatically setting the V options array on that. So you actually had to write a fair amount of JavaScript to kind of pull that off, and that's been simplified a lot in this new winter release. And then we've got in the helper, here's our kind of canned call server function, right, where we pass in the component, the remote method that we want to call, takes care of things like setting the parameters, set storable, and the callback function also deals with whether or not you want to cache the data and error handling and all that, right? So in theory, this is kind of a bridge technique, right? When Lightning Data Services goes GA in summer of 17, I believe is what they're calling for. A lot of this stuff is going to go away and it's going to be very simplified. But for now, there are things we need to do just to kind of get through the day and make sure that we've got some consistency there, right? All right. And then our server controller is very simple. We're just going and pulling data from a custom object. Now, if we compare that against what we've got here in winter, okay, it's simplified by quite a bit. One of the things that we're doing, and again as a best practice, I can specify a type on a variable that corresponds to my custom object type on force.com. And we're using all Lightning namespace components. So there's nothing here to load SLDS. SLDS is auto-loaded for you. And then we've got our, we don't need the div class slids anymore, so that goes away. And then I've got a Lightning button which is wrapping a div tag, and all of the styles for the button are on the div tag, and then the Lightning button actually handles the actual click event. On Lightning button, if you specify variant equals base, it won't give you the standard kind of raised edges around the border. So that's really nice, did a great job on that. I've got Lightning select. Instead of actually having to populate that select box using JavaScript, we can now do it declaratively through an Aura iteration. Okay, so I think that's actually an improvement. And if we take a look at things like the controller gets quite a bit simplified. So we're still calling call server. We go and we take the data that was returned, and we can just drop that right into a component attribute that will trigger the redraw on the Aura iteration, right? So I don't have to loop through that client side, and it just saves us a lot of typing. Now, there was a little gotcha that I ran into, and I need to still walk this back to the Lightning team, which is, in this case, we're dynamically creating these options in the select, but there's a little bit of latency there for the creation period to happen. So before we can actually set the default value, we need to wait about 20 milliseconds or so for those option tags to actually be there. So little bit of a kludge there, but works reasonably well. And then our panic button helper is basically the same as it was before, very straightforward. So by using these new Lightning components, if you're using any of those UI widgets from previous releases, you definitely want to make that your first stop in terms of things you change, and roll out those new Lightning namespace components, because they're going to make things a lot easier. When you take a look at the CSS here, this is the CSS that was used to pull things off in winter. And so we've only got about 33 lines of code there, and we compare that against summer, and it's 50, almost 60 lines of code to kind of get to the same place, right? And the delta there is because of the Lightning namespace components already pre-themed, so you don't have to roll those yourselves. Okay. All right, make sense? Everybody good? All right. So kind of getting back to our presentation. If I can find my presentation. Where'd it go? Too many browsers. There it is. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll pull this back up. All right, so consistently handling data requests for multiple records. Again, this is our call server code. Right, simplifies that. One of the big things that it's going to do for you is give you a centralized way and a consistent way of error handling. Right, that's one of the things that a lot of developers get very concerned about, just getting it to work, getting things to work. But you should always try to code up the error condition first. When I'm developing, I always kind of keep 4 things in mind: performance, scalability, robustness, security, and handling exceptions. Right. So I always try to handle those exceptions first, or think of what those exceptions might be, and make sure that they're handled consistently. So here, I'm just throwing a new error to the JavaScript console, but what I could be doing is invoking that alert component that I showed you earlier in the presentation, so that everybody gets a little, non-modal pop-up. It's very friendly that they can then, go and close. So all these things are kind of designed to kind of work together. And in terms of looking at this call server code, you don't want to be copying and pasting this into every component, every data-centric component that you build, right? So what I try to do is instead create a series of abstract components, and those abstract components are really just there to essentially act as code sharing mechanisms. So I would take that helper.callserver code that I had, I would put that into the helper for my wrap in box or my data component abstract class, and then every component that I have that needs to access data, I just extend that. So I wind up coming up with this, this library, if you will. It's being auto-loaded just by doing the extends. The other nice thing about this is, of course, as the product changes, right, instead of having to go through all of your components, you can, if you're always inheriting from a base level abstract component, you go and modify things in the abstract component, all your other components are going to change, right? So we're trying to keep things as flexible as possible in keeping up with all of the changes to the framework, okay? Right, being agile is the key. Out of all those things that I mentioned, performance, scalability, robustness. Robustness is really the ability to modify your code base to changing business requirements and changing technologies, security, and handling exceptions. It's that robustness part. It's the part of one developer being able to write code that can be easily understood and maintained over time that we consider to be the most valuable, right? So if I have an application, it's great, but it takes a week to change any significant feature. That's kind of a fail in my book. right? So one of the things that we frequently wind up doing in mobile web development is show hide operations, to take multiple views, stack them on top of each other into what I'll call a card view, and then you can basically show different aspects of that. So this is what I call a reusable deck of cards layout. And much like Highlander, there can be only one visible card at any given time. There can be only one. Get it? No? Okay, a few of you get it. All right. It had Sean Connery in it, so I figured, yeah, it's good difference. So anyway, so you can use this to develop tab panels, custom tab panels, wizards, step-by-step wizards, and toggle between different views. So as for instance, one of the places where we use that in Dev 601 here in our application is to build a custom query by example interface where I can come in, type in a letter for somebody's, name. I hit search, goes and makes a Apex call. And if I want to get back to that previous view, because these are just in cards and one's being hidden and one's being shown, I can put in a back button that fires an event and just takes me right back there. So being able to, this backwards forwards motion, being able to save state, card layouts are just totally awesome for, right? And you might notice there's also a little bit of a fade transition that's going on in there as well. A little grid component that's, nice and responsive. So in terms of looking at how to implement a card layout and make it reusable, fairly straightforward. Let's see if we can pull out some of the code for that. So actually I'll show this first over here. So I've got various iterations on this. Let's take a look here at our card layout, a trib. And to actually instantiate this, I'll actually look at, I've got some sample code here. We'll do test card.app. So basically I've got I instantiate the component, and then I've got, some div tags, and each div tag that has a card style class is, a separate card, and there can be only one that's actually going to go and be executed. And then if we take a look at what's happening here behind the scenes, so whatever's passed implicitly between the starting tag and the ending tag, those div tags wind up getting dropped right here through vbody. So you can pass attributes in Lightning both implicitly, right, as explicit attributes, or you can pass them implicitly as I demonstrated here, right, between a starting tag and an ending tag. And so what we're doing here is we're just dropping in those div tags, and then we've got you might notice here we've got an init calling setActiveCard and a change on that. So anytime this active card property changes, we want to go and flip the cards, okay? So if I look at the controller, right, when you fire when you have a scenario like this where you've got an aura handler change on an attribute, okay? And this is something that I actually discovered through using the debugging techniques, which I showed you earlier, and is not documented. This kind of came as a surprise to the doc team, that in the event object, you actually have access to both the old value and the new value. And so that actually wound up really kind of simplifying the code quite a bit to then go and figure out which card you want to turn on versus turning off. And just turning on and turning off the cards is just a matter of adding and removing the different style classes, right? So let's take a look at this actually in use. So I've got my got the card right here. So I've got test card layout. So this is kind of the code that we just saw, right? So I've got my my Autobot logo here, and if I hit show card 2, we've got a little fade effect there through CSS, and we can kind of toggle between our Autobots and our Decepticons. And again, one of the nice things, the cool things about web development is you get to do all kinds of crazy things related to CSS. So if I take a look here at our card layout styling, right? to implement the transition, just a transition property on the CSS, and then we kind of gradually move it over the space of 0.2 seconds from being visible and an opacity of 1 to an opacity of 0, right? So I showed this to one of my associates. He said, well, yeah, it's cool, but you really should show people how to do more interesting transitions. So what I did is I created a variation on this, and we've given you the code for it. So instead of calling card layout, you can call card layout or card flip. Okay, so I'm going to make this card flip. Right, and I'll go and I'll uncomment this UI button here. We'll go and we'll save that out and run it. Right, so same basic deal, but now I'm able to actually have a cool little CSS animation there on all these different cards. So that was what I call the Don Robbins memorial feature for this presentation. Right, now I need some. I didn't actually have time to work in the sound effect. I was hoping for some audience participation here, where every time you do the flip, you're the that Transformers theme. Da-na-na-na-na. It's a little too early, okay? Get everybody, just go, da-na-na-na-na. Okay. Anyway, I'm trying here. Anyway. All right, so we got that. Now, the key thing here is we've got a number of different techniques that are happening. So in this case, when the button gets pressed, okay, in this case, we're actually using a methodology that you see in a lot of the out-of-the-box components where you affect change by setting an attribute, right? And we just saw the code for that where setting the attribute and having a change event on that would allow you to go and swap things out. But a couple other ways that you could do it as well. I've got, see the card layout here. Okay, so this is kind of my preferred way of doing it. Which is you actually have an explicit method call. So in this case, I've got, on the component, I've got an aura method tag called setActiveCard. You just pass in the number of the card in the order in which they were declared, and that is going to go and do the transitions for you, right? So we can set a property to affect change. We can call a method to affect change. Okay, and then, based on some of the things that you see with out-of-the-box components, you could also go and fire an event as well. So in this case, I've got, in card layout events, I've got a, let me actually bring that up here. Okay, yep. So you can see there's actually quite a bit of additional code you need to make that work. So I've got an event that I defined where you can set a card number, fire the event, and then that event gets listened to by the component. So you see I've registered the event and I'm handling the event. So by invoking the event, that then causes the code to get triggered and execute. So the question is, which one of these do you do as a best practice? Again, it's I think for me it comes down to what's the easiest to actually implement, because less code is always better code. And using attributes or methods clearly better than firing events. But when you're building components, really the way I look at it is when the card actually flips over, that's an opportunity for you to fire an event, because you never know when you might, when some sort of container might need to use that. Okay. All right. So I got just a couple more things to discuss here. So we talked about the deck of cards, how we would actually go and put that into an app, right? Very straightforward, easy to use. Defining a handler, change handler, to go and perform an action when an attribute is actually changed. This is, again, undocumented currently, but when you do an aura handler change, right, you can get the old value and compare that against the new value. You don't have to set that as a property. You could get to the same place by defining a public method. Right. And then you can also get there by raising events. Right. Couple just other notes about using Locker-compatible functional libraries. So there are a few libraries out there that are actually really useful. You can load up as static resources, in particular Moment.js to do date handling and any kind of date conversion that you need. Works pretty well. Underscore.js, very hugely popular library out there for working with arrays and objects. Lodash, actually there's a fair amount of overlap between underscore and Lodash. So these are all things that I generally consider to be Lightning Locker safe that can improve your productivity. A few things here with underscore. And just remember that when you're using any of these third-party libraries, and none of these require jQuery, by the way, they're all self-contained, keep in mind that it's not safe to use those until your after scripts loaded event gets fired. There is going to be some latency there no matter what you do. So here you can see that I'm using underscore.pluck to pluck out the values for the LNAME field from this, from this array, which, very simple example. Typically this would be dynamic data coming back from the platform. And you got Moment.js, and you can see it's very rich for doing date-time formatting. Right. So let's talk about the danger zone for a second. I'm going to give you some code here that took me quite a while to figure out, which is disabling pull to refresh in Salesforce 1. Get it? Tom Cruise, danger zone? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, just making sure. So the first thing is disabling the Salesforce 1 pull to refresh. Well, why would you want to disable the pull to refresh? And the answer is fairly straightforward. If we take a look at the app that we've got here, if we were running this in S1, it would be, there would be a problem here as I'm kind of scrolling through. Every time I'd pull down in Salesforce 1, that would invoke the pull to refresh feature, and my whole app would reload. So I need to, it causes various issues. When you're trying to create essentially a single page app and place it into S1, you kind of need to disable that, and there's no sort of out-of-the-box way to do it. So the way that you do it, at least for now, is you wrap your application in a div tag. In this case, I'm calling it main app. And then you wind up using a renderer. So you say, after the component is rendered, I'm going to call the base after render. I'm going to get the DOM element that's represented by that div tag, and I'm going to add a touch move event listener on it. So when you tap and you start to pull down, this function is going to intercept that, and it's going to stop propagation back up to the S1 framework. So that will effectively disable pull to refresh just for your app specifically. Everything else will be left alone. Okay? And it'll give you a lot more freedom in terms of the type of single page apps that you might want to produce. Okay? MacGyver approved. Yeah. Showing my age. Yeah. I should have done the younger MacGyver. Lightning tab set. So Lightning tab set is an awesome component. Really glad that it's there. And it gives you, the Salesforce branding. The issue that I have with it is that most kind of traditional single page apps that you have, the navigation on a phone form factor is going to be at the bottom. Okay. So kind of keep in mind that anything is possible with CSS3. In this case, we're using a CSS solution to dock that tab bar at the bottom of the screen. And we're using a web font called that we put together on icomoon.io, which is a free website. They've got about 3,000 or 5,000 different icons to do some content injection and get those icons in there as buttons. And you also wind up explicitly setting height to have independently scrollable regions. So creating the icon font, very straightforward, easy to do off of icomoon.io. Highly recommend it. In this case, I'm saying that if I use that font and I output a content of E900, or it could be the letter A or letter Z, or whatever characters you want to assign there, you can drop those in. Use the @font face to load that from a static resource. Okay, so this would go inside of your CSS. And then here we're, again, on the tabs that are generated by Lightning Tab Set. We're going to go, and I'm saying find me the tab button that has a title of news and inject this piece of content, which corresponds to an icon in my web font. Okay. And then to dock the toolbar at the bottom, you just take this selector represents the tab bar. See here, I've made it responsive. You can include responsive directives inside of your component CSS. So below 500 pixels, I'm going to put this thing at a fixed position, 10 pixels from the bottom. And I'm going to set the spacing between all the buttons to be an equal margin. Right? At which point you go, ah, crazy CSS. Okay. All right, so just a few tips there to kind of help out your productivity. Hopefully you found it all useful. And if you have any questions, like maybe we've got a couple minutes.